Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Debating for America's Youth. Today, we have a special guest who is Nick DeVito, who is the 2018 NSDA National Champion in House Congressional Debate, and also the Tournament of Champions National Champion in the Congressional Debate as well. And before we begin our interview, Nick will actually be one of the members of the Ascent Debate Camp coaching staff, which is an awesome debate, which is one-on-one, very intensive, and you can actually get $25 off this summer camp if you use code ASCENTYouth. The link will be down below. Definitely check it out if you want great coaches such as Nick himself. Welcome, Nick.
How's it going, Nathan? Happy to be here. Hopefully ask some questions and have a great discussion about Congress.
I really hope so. You're very well known in the speech and debate community, and I'm really glad to be able to sit down and talk to you.
Well, that's good. Yeah, hopefully it's for some good things.
My first question is... I hope so. So my first question is, you've done really well across the board in congressional debate. How do you think you stand out in a room of very successful congressional debate members?
Yeah, so I think all congressional debate has multiple parts to it, but I think at like a fundamental core, the thing that can really separate people is the way they portray arguments, the way they do research, and how they approach things. And I think really understanding the way a round works in terms of what you need to do in order to convince judges, what other people do, is really the best way to be successful. And when I was a competitor, I was always focusing on the way I thought rounds would play out and the way people would act, and would also attune my prepping and the way I would sort of approach my speeches in order to account for that as well. Because over time, when you compete with the same people and you do the same bills, patterns really start to emerge, and it becomes easier to point out what you think will happen. And over the course of several years, you get really good at predicting what things will look like.
So you're able to build the rebuttal that you think for arguments that you expect to come up?
Yeah, that plus also understanding that if there's a bill about sanctions or foreign aid, that I know people are going to say basically the same thing, and knowing that when I'm prepping, I want to make sure my arguments directly engage with that, because that level of predictability can always be exploited by people, and the way you can exploit it can obviously have different ranges of success, and I think it worked out well for me when I was a competitor.
Definitely. And so you talked about how you got that experience from going to a bunch of rounds. Is there anything else, from someone who's maybe newer to Congress, to be able to gain that skill of predicting arguments, or is it just experience in your opinion?
I think experience was probably the main way, but it definitely wasn't the only way. When I was competing in Congress, I didn't really have anyone else who did it from my school, so I had to prep every bill, and that didn't change from the first day I did Congress to the day I graduated. So I think spending just a ton of time researching allows you to understand from a more analytical and educational standpoint the similarities between bills and topics, that if you notice there are sort of preconditions and variables that carry through between debates, you can be like, well, if I know one debate works like this and it has similar variables and connections to another debate, you might also see those patterns emerge. And it really comes from the amount of time you spend prepping, which maybe that's just because I don't have a lot of stuff to do when I was in high school, but I always enjoyed spending hours researching.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. There's actually a bill that, a topic, I guess, that comes up, which is lack of data. And then there's that analogy to the British pilots that only looked at where the planes were shot, not where they weren't shot. And I used that analogy kind of for a lot of different topics where there's a lack of data. So I know what you're talking about, general trends that you're able to use. So it cuts down on the prep time.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's easy to point out, and obviously came from experience. It's not something I picked up the first time I did Congress, but over time I noticed these patterns, and they become very helpful in directing where you want to spend your time researching.
Definitely. So I know you talked about how you look for trends, but with all of the bills, and especially because you said you prep the bills yourself, how do you spend your time efficiently prepping for, especially from prelim all the way to final round, especially for big tournaments such as NSDA Nationals, with a ton of different bills? Do you prep every single bill, or do you choose bills you think are going to be successful or going to be debated, or how do you organize your prep?
Yeah, well, my prep strategy did change, and mostly it's a combination of comfortability and a little bit of underlying ego, right? When you're a senior and you're consistently breaking, you might dedicate more time to prepping out rounds, just from the fact that they A, are the most difficult, B, you assume you might actually be in them, and C, they're the thing that really determines whether or not you're going to get those trophies or not. But generally what I would do is I would pick the bills I thought would be the most common, I would then prep them, and basically I'd spend about 2 to 3 hours doing background research per bill, then I'd spend another hour or two finding specific arguments and organizing organizing, and I would save all my cards. I would save PDFs of all of them, and after doing coaching and competing, I have about like 10,000, 11,000 PDFs saved on my computer from all the bills, and those back files really help because you organize them and you tag them, and then once you see a bill and you remember it, you go back to that folder and you can just bring it back, and that really helped cut down on prep time. So it really snowballs upon itself. But I would always try to make sure I'd spend the most amount of time understanding the basis of the topic, because this is really the thing that can make and break your speech. Watching a ton of rounds now, and even as a competitor, I could always really tell people who didn't really know what was going on, and more importantly, people who might want to fabricate things, which is becoming a continually growing problem inside of Congress. Like, being able to find out what is and isn't wrong inside of a Congress speech, and in the round itself, is exceptionally helpful, and doing prep is really the only way to get that, and really can't be circumvented. So as far as efficiency, looking back, I don't know if I was the most efficient prepper. I was definitely a very quantitative focused prepper. I would cut a lot of cards and save a lot of PDFs. But if you asked me to prep a bill, I don't know if I'd be the first one to finish, but I think I would probably be the first one to have the most comprehensive understanding of the topic.
Definitely. And then that also helps you just stand out in the round because you understand the topic on a deeper level than the other people who spent like 15 minutes on the topic.
Yeah, I think people really just sometimes overestimate how much they know and underestimate how much judges know, and sometimes that leads to things that are interesting, to say the least, in terms of a factual sense.
Yeah, definitely. So before you get into a Congress round, is there anything that you do to prepare? Do you practice speeches? Do you have some written out beforehand, or do you just go over your topic enough where you understand it? Or how do you practice when you're not in the round?
Yeah, so when I was doing Congress as a sophomore and a junior, I spent a lot of time doing practice speeches. I think probably the most fruitful drill was the start and stop, where you give a speech. If there's a fluency break or something like that, you have to restart the speech from the beginning. It was tedious, it was mind-numbing, and I hated it, but I continued to do it. By the time I was at the end of my junior year and my senior year, I kind of foregone giving practice speeches and mostly focused on prepping as much as possible. And I had, given enough practice speeches where I had been able to do things extemporaneously. I gave speeches without pads, and by the time I was a senior, I'd have very little written on my pad. It would basically just be a citation, so a website, date, name, and then the one piece of relevant info, and I'd have 3 of those on the pad, and that would really be about it. I could give an authorship on that or something like that. I'd add refutation. I'd have a person's name and their argument and stuff like that. But I definitely don't write out a lot, and I definitely tried to reduce that as I continued to prep, because especially when you're prepping everything on your own, the physical amount of time writing can be hours, so it becomes very tedious. And because I didn't want to save my legal pads from past tournaments, because it's just kind of annoying to hold on to them, I had to become much quicker at writing in shorthand.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that when I first started out Congress, I wrote out my speeches word for word, which was very hard. And also, you didn't really able to add the passion or the looking up and the engagement in the speech. And then now it's less and less on my legal pad. So I completely understand what you're saying. In terms of questions for Congress, do you have your questions out prepared beforehand, or do you just come up with questions in the round based on what the speakers are saying?
Yeah, I would never predict questions. I could probably tell you what people would ask and the kind of questions that would be posed to them based on what they would say in their speech, but I would mostly focus on people's content, because you could really tell if an argument was, say, for example, on surface very compelling, but definitely had some things that could be pointed out. And if people aren't 100% assured of their argument and are just basing it off the evidence they read, you can really point out and poke holes in those questions. And the kind of questions I would always like to ask are very small, piecemeal questions. They would always be yes or no questions, because no one would really know where they would go until they had already conceded their argument. So if someone was debating a bill about foreign aid, for example, and they were talking about corruption, you piecemeal them into conceding that the government doesn't take a lot of this aid, or that the government industry already exists. And by the time the questioning period is over, they've sort of inadvertently conceded to a lot of things because they don't really know the inner workings of their argument. And thinking about the assumptions that questions have really makes more easily pointed questions that people end up conceding to a far greater degree to.
Definitely. And what about indirect questioning? Because I know a lot of times, since you're only able to ask one question, how do you get that logic train going with a short amount of time in one question?
Yeah, so it entirely depends on tournament paradigms, because I think prefacing is something that not every tournament allows, but I think is really the only way to ask effective indirect questions. Because if you ask a question that is premised on a fact claim or any argument in the round, people won't answer the question. They will simply just reject the fact claim, and that means that no one really answers the question, and it sort of means that it's not utile for either of you. But I usually try to be given that this is true, and given that this has already been said, how is this argument true? because it either means they spend all the time trying to refute those facts, and you're making them do just on-the-spot refutation, which usually isn't that effective, or they have to concede to the assumptions that they gave you and that your question and answer will be more favorable, or it demonstrates at the very least that you know what's going on, meaning that there's some perceptual dominance that can be taken away. So it's generally a win-win-win scenario for you. It sometimes borders on the line of prefacing, but when I was a competitor, I didn't find it to be a huge problem. Maybe judges just didn't care, or I just didn't go to a lot of tournaments that cared a lot about prefacing.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds like a great way to really get them to concede or at least, like stumble, which would be better for you as a competitor. So you talked about how you practice like with fluency breaks and practicing your speeches over and over. Looking at it from a different perspective in terms of nerves, did you get nervous when you were speaking? And if so, how did you combat those nerves, like getting up in front of people?
Yeah, most people probably knew this if they were friends with me when I was a competitor. I was exceptionally nervous at every tournament in every round, whether it was prelims or 5 minutes before the award ceremonies. It got actually uniquely bad right before I graduated. I couldn't eat for the entire day. I remember for NSDA, right before NSDA finals my senior year, my coach offered me a bagel, and I just stared at it and then walked away. I was like, that's not happening. I would get so nervous. And really the only way to overcome fears is to become comfortable being nervous. So what I would try to do is I would try to get myself really excited and amped up right before the tournament started. And like when I was getting ready in the morning, I would make sure to be as amped up as possible. I drank probably an inappropriate amount of Red Bull in order to make sure that I was energized. And I would sort of just get used to being nervous because it required just practice. Like I never got over my anxiety. Like regardless of how well I had thought I did, I'd be like, I'm not going to break out of this prelim or I'm not going to break out of this semi. And regardless of how founded or unfounded those feelings were, they never really changed. So I always envied the people who were like very successful that had like managed to not be nervous or at the very least appear to not be nervous, because I was incapable of doing that. I would just sort of slouch on the couches right outside of the tournament rooms and our rounds and just hope that the break would come out soon, because I would just be going nuts until that happened.
Definitely, yeah. I felt those same kind of feelings. In terms of like giving speeches, did you have prepared introductions, like prepared out, or did you come up with based on your research, or how did you work your introductions?
I would make sure that everything would be extemporaneous from the performative side, that no Nick DeVito speech would ever be symmetric or identical to a one that was ever given. I wouldn't write out intros, I don't write out conclusions, I don't write out rhetoric. I just speak, and I try to speak to the people that are in the room and try to give compelling prose that's sort of right off the dome. At first, it was hard and it was difficult, but after practicing it for a considerable amount of time and dedicating months and months to it, it became something that was far more useful and actually really did benefit me. But I tried to minimize the amount of stuff that was written on my pad, also improved with flexibility, because I think when you pre-write an introduction, it at best would require you to know such a grand amount of information about what was going on in the round and what people were saying that you would have to overcome what definitely is the variables of all the other people speaking and the arguments that come up. So you want to make sure your intros are as applicable as possible. So it means that pre-writing intros is nearly impossible to really effectively do.
Yeah, so you talked about it off the top of the dome, but do you try to relate it to other speeches in the round so that you can jump into your refutation or into your like supporting of other points that have been made in the round?
I would actually try to connect it to a general feeling or idea of my speech. Like if I could condense the thesis of my speech to a singular sentence, I would try to have an intro that was based off that. So if we were debating a foreign policy bill, I think a great example is like Saudi arms. I would talk about how American foreign policy is largely focused on advancing its own interests, try to make the judge in their mind sort of internalize that the negation has some sort of defense of an inner selfishness of America or some interest that is probably superseding some basic consideration. And that would sort of be the crux of my intro, that if you could boil down my speech to like a sentence or a collection of words, that the intro would sort of reflect a basic idea that the judge could latch onto.
Definitely. That sounds like a really solid plan. And so, since you'll be a coach at the Ascent Debate Camp, do you have any advice just for these people watching this video for a novice who is just getting started in congressional debate? Is there anything that you wish you knew going in, or that you think a novice would benefit by knowing?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. I think if I had to restart my Congress career, like if someone told me that next week I would start off as a completely fresh Congress novice, I would definitely dedicate more time when I was a younger debater and an underclassman to like doing more prep and understanding more things about the topics. I understand the incentives that exist, like if you're on a team with a lot of people, you might share prep, or if you have friends or people you went to camp with. But I think over time, many debaters realize that if they want to be as successful as possible, getting things in terms of prep or trying to cut corners will ultimately only harm you in the end. And when I was a younger debater, I tried to do that a lot, and like it had different levels of success in terms of my ability to, like, get prep from friends and get stuff like that. But I think really there is no replacement for the hard work that requires you to be very successful in debate. And regardless of what it looks like that other people are or not putting in a lot of work, that you should always try to be as honest as possible. And I think that's probably the best advice I could give to people who are just starting to do Congress, that it is a Herculean task at times and definitely seems to sort of wane in its ability to make you seem fulfilled or just seems too time consuming. But I think ultimately it would always be worth it.
Definitely, and from as one of the few Congress members on my team, I understand having to prep all those bills, but it is rewarding, and I did learn a lot throughout my process of doing it. So, in conclusion, is there anything, now that you're out of the congressional debate realm, and I know you're coaching, but like you're out of being a competitor, is there anything you would like to say to the speech and debate community as a whole? Is there a message or something that you would like to just like thank the people who are part of the community of speech and debate?
Yeah, I definitely think that as a coach, and like obviously all of the kids I coach I'm very close with and I definitely like, but I definitely think that competitors overall should really appreciate the people who I think really make congressional debate and speech as a whole really work. And it's not necessarily the people who are the most optical and the most present, and that is the people who run the NSDA and stuff like that, because I think obviously they're very important, but I think it's the coaches and the young people who donate hours upon their time and really don't get appreciated as much as I think they do in order to make sure that this can actually operate as an institution overall. And I think those people definitely deserve greater amounts of recognition. I also think, more importantly, that if I wanted to say anything to the congressional debate community, that I know there is a lot of sort of elitism and ranking that happens inside of speech and debate, and people try to compare events between each other, but you should never feel discouraged, and more importantly, you should never try to engage in the ranking of the importance or the intellectual rigor of these things. Like, I know a lot of people will always be like, Congress is a speech event, it's not a real debate event. Those people are haters, they're just losers. And I think at times we can be a little bit more derisive than we probably should. And I think that would probably be the best advice I could give to people, especially because even though Congress is attempting to be some approximation of adults in a legislative chamber, we are ultimately a collection of high schoolers. And as a result, normal clickiness and things that happen when we're younger and a little bit more immature still predominate the social interactions we have. But those would probably be the things I would say to people who are just starting in the community writ large.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, because I think that as much as people attack congressional debate as a whole, as a congressional debater, I understand that. I think that a lot of people miss that there's different skills in different events, right? Like Congress, you have to, there's an extemporaneous side to it that you might not get in other debate events. And then there's also the side of you have to get up and give it more of an impassioned speech versus just focusing on the argument. So I think that there's so many skills, and finding the event that matches best with who you are is what's important out of speech and debate.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I definitely agree with that.
So I just want to thank you for coming on, and just to remind everyone, I just want to thank everyone for watching this video. And remember, if you want to work with an awesome coach such as Nick, you guys can sign up down below, join the Ascent Camp, and I'm sure Nick will have other coaching opportunities in the future if you want to work with him there.
Yeah, definitely sign up for Ascent. Hope to